Medieval warfare is often imagined through images of shining knights and castle sieges, but the reality was far more complex and terrifying. Across Europe, the Middle East, and the steppes of Asia, different warrior classes emerged whose tactics, discipline, and brutality changed the course of history. These fighters were not just soldiers. They represented organized systems of war, fueled by faith, politics, or survival, and their presence on the battlefield could break armies and reshape entire regions. Looking at 5 of the most formidable groups reveals how fear itself became a weapon as powerful as any sword or spear. Number 1. The Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights were not simply armored warriors roaming the battlefields of medieval Europe. They were a monastic military order founded at the end of the 12th century by German crusaders in the Holy Land. What began as a charitable brotherhood, caring for sick and wounded pilgrims, quickly transformed into one of the most formidable fighting forces of the Middle Ages. Bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the knights combined religious devotion with the discipline of professional soldiers, creating an organization that blurred the line between monastery and army. Their iconic appearance contributed to their fearsome reputation. The white surcoats emblazoned with a stark black cross made them instantly recognizable, and when they rode in formation as heavy cavalry, they presented the image of a relentless, almost spectral army descending upon their enemies. Unlike ordinary knights, who often fought for personal gain or feudal obligation, the Teutonic Knights believed they were chosen instruments of divine will. This conviction gave them a ruthless determination, especially during their campaigns in Eastern Europe, where they sought to convert pagan populations by force. The order's expansion into the Baltic regions of Prussia and Livonia during the 13th and 14th centuries was marked by a strategy that was as pragmatic as it was terrifying. They perfected the practice of winter campaigning, moving across frozen rivers and marshes when local tribes thought themselves safe from attack. Entire villages were burned, populations were deported or killed, and survivors were pressured into baptism under the looming presence of armed monks. For communities unaccustomed to the scale and organization of Western-style warfare, the arrival of the Teutonic Knights was overwhelming. Equally intimidating were the massive fortresses they constructed to secure conquered territory. Castles such as Marienburg, with its red brick walls, towers, and moats, were not just military strongholds, but administrative and religious centers. These towering complexes symbolized permanence, a message to conquered peoples that the order was not merely passing through, but intended to dominate the landscape for generations. The psychological impact of the Teutonic Knights should not be underestimated. Contemporary chroniclers often depicted them as merciless, enforcing conversion through sword and fire. Tales of massacres, such as the infamous sack of Gdansk in 1308, spread quickly and amplified their aura of dread. What made them so terrifying was not only their martial skill, but the fusion of sacred mission and military precision. They embodied the idea that war itself could be holy, and for those who stood against them, defeat meant not only the loss of land, but also the destruction of their way of life. Number 2. The Ghazis. The Ghazis were frontier warriors of Islam who emerged during the Middle Ages as both defenders and expansionists along the unstable borders between Muslim and Christian worlds. Unlike mercenaries or feudal levies, their motivation was religious conviction. They believed that fighting and dying in the path of God assured eternal reward, and this belief gave them a persistence and fearlessness that made them particularly dangerous. Their origins can be traced to the shifting frontiers of the Byzantine Empire, Anatolia, and the Balkans, where tribal warriors and local fighters organized into loose but determined bands. These men were not weighed down by the heavy mail of Western knights. Instead, they emphasized mobility and endurance, moving swiftly on horseback, carrying composite bows, curved sabers, and light shields. This allowed them to strike suddenly and vanish before an enemy could mount a proper defense. The effectiveness of the Ghazis lay in their mastery of raids. Entire villages could be devastated overnight. They swept across borderlands, burning settlements, seizing goods, and taking captives who were often enslaved or ransomed. For local populations, this meant living in a constant state of insecurity. Chroniclers describe communities that slept with weapons at hand, expecting at any moment to hear the thunder of hooves and the shouts of attackers. Armies raised to resist them frequently found themselves chasing shadows, as Ghazis retreated into mountains or across plains, only to return once defenders relaxed. It was this pattern of relentless pressure, generation after generation, that made them so feared. Their presence blurred the line between banditry and holy war, but to those living on the frontier, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was the destruction they left behind. As their numbers grew, Ghazi groups became more organized, sometimes aligning with powerful rulers who used their zeal as a weapon of state expansion. In Anatolia, Ghazis formed the backbone of early Turkish principalities, particularly the Ottomans. Before the rise of a centralized Ottoman army, it was Ghazi warriors who carried the banners into Byzantine territories, paving the way for conquest. Their raiding tradition provided valuable experience in mobility, siege tactics, and psychological warfare, lessons that larger empires would later adopt on a broader scale. Their ideology reinforced the sense that war was not simply for power or wealth, but a sacred duty. This combination of religious fervor and practical military utility meant that Ghazis could not easily be dismissed as irregulars. They were, in effect, a cultural institution that kept borderlands unstable and ensured that conflict between faiths remained alive across centuries. The terror they inspired came from more than just their raids. It came from their persistence and their willingness to return again and again, regardless of losses. Where European knights might withdraw after a failed campaign, Ghazis interpreted hardship as proof of their devotion. They embodied the idea of endless frontier warfare, a cycle of violence and resistance that reshaped entire regions of the medieval world. To face them was to fight an enemy who did not measure victory only in land or treasure, but in spiritual fulfillment, and that made them more relentless than conventional medieval armies. Number 3. The Janissaries. The Janissaries represented one of the most disciplined and formidable military classes of the medieval and early modern world. They were born out of the Ottoman devshirme system, a practice in which Christian boys were taken from their families in the Balkans and Anatolia, converted to Islam, and placed into rigorous training programs designed to mold them into soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. This method ensured that recruits had no hereditary ties or obligations that could compromise their devotion. From a young age, they were removed from traditional family life and immersed in a culture of discipline, obedience, and absolute loyalty, making them distinct from the knightly orders of Europe, who were often driven by feudal bonds and family interests. The training of a Janissary was comprehensive. It combined strict religious education with military exercises, instilling both spiritual devotion and martial skill. They learned archery, swordsmanship, and horsemanship, but what truly set them apart was their early adoption of gunpowder weapons. By the 15th century, while many European armies still relied heavily on knights and crossbows, Janissaries were already fielding matchlock muskets and using organized volley fire. This gave them a tactical edge and allowed the Ottomans to break through the defenses of fortified cities and crush heavily armored opponents who were unprepared for firearms used at such a scale. Their combination of traditional skills with modern weapons positioned them as a force centuries ahead of their time. Equally terrifying was their battlefield presence. The Janissaries marched to the sound of the meter, the Ottoman military band, whose deep drums and piercing horns could be heard for miles. The psychological effect of this music was profound. It signaled to defenders that the Sultan's elite troops were approaching, often leading to panic before a fight even began. Unlike feudal knights who charged as individuals or in loose groups, Janissaries fought in coordinated ranks, drilled to act as one body. They held formation under fire, advanced in unison, and maintained discipline that was rare in medieval warfare, making them difficult to rout even in the most chaotic battles. Their role extended beyond the battlefield. The Janissaries were political symbols of the Sultan's power, stationed at the heart of the empire and serving as his personal guard. Their presence in a campaign often indicated that the Ottomans intended complete domination, as they were reserved for the most critical operations. Victories such as the fall of Constantinople in 1453 highlighted their effectiveness, as disciplined Janissary gunfire and assaults overwhelmed defenders who had once considered their city impregnable. What made the Janissaries terrifying was not just their skill or weapons, but their unwavering unity and loyalty. They were an institutionalized warrior class, removed from traditional society, reshaped into soldiers who embodied the authority of an empire. Facing them meant facing a force that combined religious zeal, cutting-edge military technology, and organizational discipline at a level unmatched by most medieval armies. They became a model of professional standing troops that would inspire European powers to develop their own centralized armies, but in their time, they stood as one of the most advanced and feared warrior classes in history. Number 4. The Swiss Pikemen. The rise of the Swiss Pikemen in the late Middle Ages marked one of the most dramatic shifts in European warfare. These were not armored nobles on horseback, but disciplined infantrymen, often drawn from farming communities in the Swiss cantons. They carried pikes that could reach over 5 meters in length, weapons simple in design, yet devastating in practice. The power of this formation lay in its unity. Hundreds of men standing shoulder to shoulder, advancing as one solid wall bristling with steel. To cavalry, the dominant force of the medieval battlefield for centuries, such a formation was a nightmare. Horses would not willingly impale themselves on rows of sharpened points, and charges that once crushed peasant levies were brought to a sudden halt in chaos and blood. What made the Swiss particularly terrifying was not just their weaponry, but their discipline. Unlike feudal armies, where knights pursued personal glory and cohesion often broke down, Swiss infantry trained to act collectively. Their reputation for stubbornness and precision developed after battles such as Morgarten in 1315 and Sempach in 1386, where they defeated larger, heavily armored forces of Austrian knights. Chroniclers of the period noted the shock these victories produced across Europe. The image of commoners on foot defeating nobles who had long defined the social and military order sent ripples of fear through aristocratic circles. The battlefield humiliation was not merely tactical, it was social and symbolic. The Swiss also refined their tactics into aggressive offensives. They were not content with standing defensively behind pikes, but advanced in deep columns, pressing their opponents and overwhelming them with coordinated thrusts. This offensive style made them valuable mercenaries, and by the 15th century, rulers across Europe sought to hire Swiss units to strengthen their armies. Their services were expensive, but their effectiveness was undeniable. Opponents who faced them often described their methodical advance as unstoppable, and once a formation gained momentum, breaking it proved nearly impossible without devastating losses. The psychological impact of their presence was immense. For mounted knights, to see a mass of pikemen steadily closing in meant not only the danger of death, but the erosion of centuries of dominance. Feudal cavalry had been the backbone of European warfare, a symbol of noble privilege, and now lines of disciplined infantrymen peasants turned soldiers rendered that power obsolete. This transformation forced military leaders to rethink their strategies, eventually contributing to the decline of knightly supremacy and the rise of professional standing armies. The terror of the Swiss pikemen lay in their combination of simplicity and effectiveness. Their weapons were crude compared to the ornate swords of knights, but in disciplined hands they shattered the old order. They demonstrated that warfare was changing. Skill, organization, and collective determination could outweigh the prestige of noble blood and the strength of armor. To medieval societies accustomed to a rigid hierarchy, that realization was as frightening as the pike walls themselves. Number 5. The Mongol Heavy Cavalry. The Mongol Heavy Cavalry stood as one of the most terrifying military forces of the medieval period, not only because of their sheer effectiveness, but also because of the speed and scale with which they transformed battlefields. Emerging from the vast steppes of Central Asia in the early 13th century, these warriors combined the mobility of steppe horse archers with the crushing power of armored lancers. Unlike the lightly equipped riders who relied only on mobility, the heavy cavalry of the Mongols wore lamellar armor made of hardened leather, iron, or a combination of both, and their horses were often protected as well. Armed with lances, sabers, and composite bows, they were versatile enough to adapt to any situation on the battlefield. shifting between missile fire and shock charges with precision. What set them apart was the integration of discipline and strategy with traditional steppe tactics. The Mongols perfected the feigned retreat, a maneuver in which a unit pretended to flee in panic, drawing enemy forces into overextension. Once the opponents broke formation in pursuit, hidden reserves of heavy cavalry struck from the flanks or rear, encircling and annihilating them. Medieval armies accustomed to straightforward engagements were often unable to counter such deception, and entire forces were destroyed in traps that were carefully prepared in advance. Reports from European and Islamic chroniclers alike emphasize the demoralizing effect of these tactics. Commanders could never be sure whether a retreat was genuine or a calculated lure. Their impact extended beyond open field battles. The Mongols brought with them sophisticated siege techniques learned through contact with Chinese and Persian engineers. Heavy cavalry might sweep across the countryside to isolate a city, while siege specialists constructed trebuchets, catapults, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons to reduce fortified walls. Castles that had stood for centuries against traditional assaults fell within days or weeks once Mongol forces applied their combined arms approach. The fall of cities such as Kiev, Baghdad, and countless others sent shockwaves across continents, reinforcing the image of the Mongols as an unstoppable tide. For those who survived, the devastation left behind was a warning. Chronicles speak of towns reduced to ashes, populations massacred, and fields littered with bones. Survivors carried stories of merciless discipline, where disobedience within Mongol ranks was punished by death, and loyalty to their commanders was absolute. This internal order translated into extraordinary efficiency in warfare. Armies that moved faster, struck harder, and coordinated better than almost any medieval opponent. To European powers unprepared for such speed, the sudden arrival of Mongol heavy cavalry felt less like conventional war and more like an unstoppable natural disaster. The terror lay not only in their weapons or armor, but in the combination of mobility, strategy, and ruthlessness. The Mongol heavy cavalry represented the fusion of steppe tradition with organized imperial ambition, a force that reshaped both Asia and Europe. For medieval societies accustomed to slower, more predictable wars, their appearance meant the collapse of old certainties, proving that even the strongest fortresses or most prestigious knightly orders could be broken by disciplined horsemen sweeping in from the horizon.